Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look then at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the Conservative commentator Tim Mongomerie and the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, Kezia Dugdale. And they'll be with us right through until midnight. So to the front pages then, let's start with the Telegraph. In the wake of today's A-level results, the Telegraph reporting that ministers are considering scrapping letter grades and replacing them with numbers in an effort to more accurately reflect pupils' performances. The Guardian points out the disparity between the higher grades given to private school students and the lower marks given to their state school counterparts. The Metro reacts to the civil lawsuit brought against Prince Andrew in the US, alleging sexual abuse. Their headline, enough to make a duke sweat. We should point out he strongly denies the claims. The Financial Times leading with the US Senate's passage of a landmark infrastructure bill that will see $1 trillion pumped into its ailing transport system. The Sun hears that dancer Nadia Bishkova, who's due to appear on the upcoming series of Strictly, has tested positive for COVID. And the Star says the spices used in South Asian food can have an aphrodisiac effect. As it does. Anyway, Tim Mongomerie, Kezia Dugdale are here, and welcome to both of you. Lots of news about exam results, whether it be the Highers in Scotland or the A-levels. And Kezia, The Guardian, pointing out that the gap between private and state school pupils has grown again, amidst a backdrop, of course, of escalating grades, grade inflation we used to call it, but now we say, well done to the students.
Yes, and we should say well done because they've come through one of the worst years imaginable in terms of their education, the kind of wider effects on society, and the newspapers and the news bulletins are full of pictures of young people celebrating. But there's a darker, more worrying story behind the scenes, and that's that the gap between those pupils from state schools and those from private schools is, as The Guardian describes, as large as it's been in the modern era. So what we know is that COVID exacerbates pre-existing inequalities, and that applies to the school system as much as it does anything else.
And Tim, it's not just the difference, is it, between state school pupils who got nearly 45% of A or A star, while independent sector got around 70% of A or A star. There seems to be a gender gap issue as well that The Guardian highlights, a subject gap that some subjects did better under this teacher assessment than others, and a regional disparity too. Suggestions that the northeast of England, for example, which we know was badly hit with COVID, as one minister said today, has levels of deprivation, also saw poorer figures. So what COVID has done is thrown up all these difficulties, haven't they? Where does this leave us now as we go forward then?
Well, I think it leaves our exam system in a complete mess. Clearly, the grades that have been awarded to students aren't comparable with anything we've seen before. And if normally we were seeing a widening gap between private and state schools, between boys and girls, between different regions, we'd want to look at perhaps some of the structural reasons why that was happening. Just for this year and the last year, we can't really trust the grades, unfortunately. And as soon as possible, we need to get back to some sort of normality where teachers, in particular, aren't marking their own pupils' exam results. Now, I completely agree with what Kezia has just said. The kids involved, the students involved, they've had a terrible couple of years. And we absolutely, as a society, owe them all the support and comfort we can. But the exam system, if it carries on like this, will completely lose the confidence of employers and universities. And we have to get back to a system where exams are independently marked and certified as soon as possible.
And that's the point made in the Financial Times, isn't it, Kezia? You obviously, John Smith Centre, University of Glasgow. Top grades for 45% of A-level entries sets tough questions for universities. Now, it's certainly pointed out for England that when A's became too high, nearly 25%, and that's when the A star was brought in around a decade ago. You've got a bigger issue now that universities simply can't distinguish the very good students from the truly best students. So what do universities do? And does it matter for these 2 years? Is this just a blip and not to take it too seriously?
Well, there is an element of taking big public policy decisions off the back of a pandemic that might be ill-advised. I think there's a much more fundamental question here, though, which is about the role of exams in the school system and indeed the wider education system that we should be asking ourselves. Lots of universities across the country are reviewing whether they're going to have what we call high-stake assessments at all anymore. This idea that an exam at one point in a calendar year decides your future fate is perhaps now outdated, and we should have a lot more continuous assessment, lots more types of assessments which are more like real life, like presentation skills or writing brief papers rather than 5,000-word dissertations. There's lots of ways in which the education system can evolve. I teach at the University of Glasgow, and all of these questions are being asked in our own institution. If we change at the University of Glasgow and all the Russell Group institutions change their ways, then there's even more pressure on the school system to ask itself if exams is the right way forward.
Yeah, well, we had that, didn't we? We had continuous assessments. The problem is, there's a gender bias to that. It seemed to favour girls, Tim. Teach to exams is the other criticism, obviously. Daily Telegraph suggesting that A-levels themselves need to be thrown out now, perhaps bring in a numbered-based system like GCSEs, which have 1 to 9, maybe 9 to 3. I heard one suggestion today. Is it time to look again, do you think, or is it time to really think, do exams deliver what they need to do?
I certainly think it's one thing that the government needs to look at, the whole education system needs to look at. And obviously it's the thing we're focused on today because we've had A-level results. If I was Education Secretary or Prime Minister, I'm not sure it would be my priority just at the moment. I think the fundamental priority for the education system is to particularly look at the catch-up challenge facing particularly disadvantaged pupils. If you're a kid lucky enough to have a supportive home where your parents are perhaps reasonably well educated themselves, you've suffered during this COVID period, but probably you've been relatively well supported. If you're in a home, perhaps a home where you share a bedroom with a younger sibling or something, where your parents haven't themselves attained in traditional educational way, you haven't been that well supported. That's where I think the Education Secretary should be focusing his efforts. And unfortunately, as we've seen today, the Education Secretary gave miserable performances on most of the morning interviews he undertook. He didn't really answer any of the questions I heard him posed by Nick Robinson on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme today. I'm a Conservative supporter, Anna, but I think he's about the worst cabinet minister we've had since the Conservatives came to power in 2010. We need someone new in charge of the education system. He's simply not up to the job, and we really need Boris Johnson to get on with a much-needed reshuffle.
Well, I was going to ask you about that just very quickly then. Will there be one? What's your reckoning?
I think there should have been one already. Mrs. Thatcher, when she had her reshuffles, always did them at the start of the summer, and that allowed ministers, as they were on holiday away from Parliament, to begin to read into their briefs. I don't quite understand it, but the Prime Minister's hesitancy on a reshuffle just means that he's not getting the right calibre of ministers in place in a timely way.
Well, the Telegraph pointing out that Gavin Williamson suggested that any switch to a numerical grading system would take a little bit longer to be implemented and would not be ready for next year's exams. The paper suggests, his comments suggest that grade inflation will continue for a number of years until any new system is ready to be implemented. We'll have to wait and see, obviously. Kezia, should we go to the Metro now? This is after the news broke in New York last night. Their headline, as they show Prince Andrew, looks like arriving in Balmoral for a Scottish summer break, enough to make a Duke sweat, referencing obviously that interview he did with Newsnight some time ago. But it doesn't go away, does it, for the royal family?
No, this is a deeply uncomfortable story for the wider royal family as much as it is for Prince Andrew himself, who's of course denying all of the allegations put towards him. However, he's already taken a couple of steps back from public life. It's hard to see how much further he can retreat without facing out to some of these questions. A very difficult few days ahead for Prince Andrew, because I think the story will only grow arms and legs. And it's also worth pointing out that should this issue end up in the civil courts in America, it might just happen at the same time as the royal family would rather we were all talking about the Platinum Jubilee next summer. So the timing's unfortunate. These are very serious allegations, and it's hard to see how Prince Andrew will have any other choice than to make some more public comments about them.
And he's taken on a very important role for the Queen, hasn't he? Often being there by her side, spending time with her. Will people have sympathy with her, do you think, during this? Tim, what will the reaction be to this?
Well, I think the public loves the Queen. The Queen has popularity ratings that politicians would dream of having. Prince Andrew does not have those popularity ratings, and none of us know what the truth of these latest allegations are. But we do know, Anna, from that Newsnight interview you mentioned, the alibis that he put forward, such as going to the Woking Pizza Express, didn't add up. We saw him sort of wriggle about the fact that he revisited the sex offender, the heart of these allegations, now dead, of course, when he really shouldn't have touched him with a barge pole. And we know that, some of his, he just didn't show any remorse for even having any connection with that whole setup. And his reputation has been so damaged by that interview that the public will have little sympathy for him, I fear. But, people are innocent until proven guilty. But I think in terms of his general judgment, he's already been tried in the court of public opinion and been found guilty.
Yes, this, of course, is a civil case in the New York courts, Kezia. Most of those are settled. It has big implications of whether or not he's required to give evidence. But listening to a New York professor speaking to my colleague a little earlier about this, the suggestion is that evidence heard in a civil case could then lead to a criminal case, which is what happened to Ghislaine Maxwell. So definitely tense times, and keeping his lawyers close, no doubt.
Yes, absolutely. And there's also a huge difference between civil and criminal proceedings around whether or not Prince Andrew could be, in some circumstance, forced to give evidence. If it remains a civil case, it's quite likely that he wouldn't have to hear the charges. In fact, it's pretty difficult, as we've heard from experts today, for even a writ to be served across the Atlantic Ocean. So he's not going to be able to wriggle out of the process completely. It's just a lot more difficult. But as you say, should civil lead to criminal, that's a completely different ballgame. And suddenly things like extradition rules can kick in, and he could be forced to face charges if it were to end in that situation. And of course, we have to say that these are very serious allegations, but they are allegations.
And The Guardian, the FT showing a little boy cowering the suggestions that Afghans are fleeing the Taliban tide. And certainly we know that the Defence Secretary here in the UK is watching nervously. One wonders what Joe Biden thinks of this, having pulled out the Americans. But, I mean, this is just not good, is it, Tim?
This story, Anna, makes my blood boil, to be honest. And that picture on the front of the FT, that poor little child, with rubbish around him and the possessions of his family, probably fleeing from persecution. The Western world made a promise to Afghanistan that we wouldn't run away from, the intervention that we made. And we have done that. President Biden, when he was in Cornwall for the G7 summit, said America is back. Well, I'm afraid America is back home. We've abandoned people like that little boy. I think we've abandoned the memory of a lot of people, including British soldiers, who died in Afghanistan. I think the sacrifices that we made have allowed a huge number of women to be educated in that country. We freed a people, nearly 40 million people, from one of the most murderous, odious regimes, the Taliban regime, and to have given up now, withdrawn in such a precipitate way, it is shameful. And I'm afraid in a world where we're in a strategic competition with the likes of Russia and China, to have abandoned our responsibilities and to bring into question the trustworthiness of the West, I think it's shameful, really shameful.
Well, the FT says, quoting an EU official, said the militants now controlled 65% of the country. A UN official added that advances in human rights in the 20 years since the Islamists were ousted risked being erased. And the front of The Guardian has an article by a young female journalist who says, 2 days ago, I had to flee my home and life in the north of Afghanistan after the Taliban took my city. I am still on the run and there is no safe place for me to go. Last week, I was a news journalist. Today, I can't write under my own name or say where I am from or where I am. My whole life has been obliterated in just a few days. I am so scared and I don't know what will happen to me. That is a young woman who was a journalist and presumably will not be able to be one after this, Kezia.
Yes, it's utterly haunting and devastating, and I wouldn't say a word out of kilter with what Tim has just described. I think he's absolutely right, and I actually don't think all the US troops have left Afghanistan yet. There was a promise that they would all be gone by an arbitrary date set by President Biden in September, so I think it's quite possible there are still troops there, although they're on their way out, and yet we're in the situation whereby 65% of the territory has already been taken back by the Taliban, and we see the practical realities of what that means in these stories. It's that little 5-year-old boy in a rubbish heap. It's women who had rights, a matter of years ago, feeling now like they've got no future whatsoever. So it's utterly devastating, and we should feel collectively very guilty about this. Throughout history, Afghanistan has suffered at the hands of other countries. So many promises made, so many promises broken, and each and every time we somehow seem surprised at what we've left behind. I couldn't agree more with what Tim has said tonight.
To the Telegraph now, Tim. Alok Sharma, president of the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference, still drives a diesel car. Feels like one of those questions when politicians used to be asked how much is a pint of milk. It's kind of that basic, isn't it?
It is, really. And he's had a bad week, Alok Sharma, because I think it was about this time last week we were learning that he'd been jetting around the world avoiding quarantine rules that apply to the rest of us. And I had a little bit of more sympathy with him last week, because actually we do know that Zoom meetings work okay, but actually if you really want to, get stuff done with people, face-to-face meetings work. But I think if you're trying to convince the rest of the world and the public that you're serious about the environment, I think I would have traded in my diesel car by now and already got an electric car.
Yes, he says it will almost certainly be an electric car next time. That's not 100% convincing either, is it? Tim Mongomerie, Kezia Dugdale, super to have you both on. Thank you.